the 1970s in Brazil, I mean, that's 30 years ago now, of course it was a totally different climate. The military had been in power since 1964. It was a very, very repressive regime. There was a lot of violation of human rights, there was repression, censorship. And working there as a journalist, I mean, you came up against all this. You came up against it not only in your work, because it was difficult to get information. You felt your phones were being censored. You felt perhaps sometimes you were being followed or watched or so on. I mean, it was a society living in a certain amount of fear. But at the same time, it was an incredibly interesting time because resistance was growing to the military regime. You had the beginning of trade union movements who were fighting back. I mean, strikes afterward had been banned. And so you had the first big strikes in 1978, and that was an incredibly sort of exhilarating moment. That's when Lula really first appeared as a leader. Then you had the students going onto the streets and protesting and being chased by the military. I mean, the background to this, of course, was a lot of people in prison, military tribunals, torture, and union leaders being murdered. So it was a very violent background, but at the same time, things were beginning to happen. So it was a time of fear, but also a time of sort of exhilaration. And in rural areas as well, you had a lot of violence because you had squatter farmers and peasant farmers being expelled from their land, in the Amazon particularly, as development projects moved up there, big landowners moved up there. And in the south, you had the beginning, really, of what came afterwards.
Yes, it was quite a separate movement. It wasn't linked with the urban trade union movements, but you had rural workers in the south of Brazil beginning to organise, and there was the political space because people were beginning to feel that the military regime was weakening and they wouldn't be the same degree of repression. The press was beginning to be freer, so these things were reported in the press. So when the situation got difficult in Rio Grande do Sul, there was the construction of the Itaipu, a huge hydroelectric power station, which evicted hundreds of families from the land. They didn't have anywhere to go. There were a lot of small holdings in Rio Grande do Sul. They had big families, and so the second, third, fourth sons didn't have land. And the government was, remember, Jan, they were trying to take these families up to the Amazon, and some of the families went because the government was promising them big holdings. And they got quite large areas of land up there, but what the government hadn't told them was just how difficult the conditions were going to be up there, how much malaria there was, how difficult it was going to be to market their crops, how isolated they were going to be. And those first families that went up suffered a lot. So they came back and they said, no, you mustn't go up there. We've got to struggle for land here in the south of Brazil. So they began to organise, and it was with the support of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, which was radical at the time, it was liberation theology, this preferential option for the poor. So it was the church that facilitated the gathering together of these peasant families.
The church was incredibly important actually at that time, because when you remember that everything else had been sort of closed down or censored, but they couldn't close down the Catholic Church. So the church had physical space for meetings, it had telephones for people to help organise with, and it had all these radical priests and incredibly sort of charismatic bishops who played such an important role. So in fact the church set up the first movement, if you like, for land reform to a certain extent, the Pastoral Land Commission, with the Lutheran Church, by the way. It wasn't just the Catholics in the south particularly, it was the Lutheran Church. And that's really that Pastoral Land Commission, which began by denouncing all the violence in the Amazon particularly, but really sort of fed into the creation of the MST later on.
Yes, it was the two things coming together, the landless peasants and this radical Catholic Church. And so they began to meet in the villages. And I remember we interviewed one priest who said his spine tingled when he was reading. They were reading together one of their chosen texts, Exodus, and talking about the promised land, the land of milk and honey. and the people there were saying, yes, that's us. We're going to get our land of milk and honey. And so they began to be aware that the people were actually living the Bible. And it was an exciting process for all of them. It was the coming together of these various circumstances, the fact that repression wasn't as great, that you had a radicalised Catholic Church, and you had radical landless peasants who were prepared to risk a lot to win land. It was the coming together of this that led to the creation of the movements.